Although it would be nice to think of a world where science isn't politicized, the way that we do scientific research is based on long-standing power dynamics that persist even to this day. So to make sure that the scientific endeavour is impacting as many people in society as possible, as fairly as possible, we're chatting about science and social justice with Professor Jenny Reardon. Jenny, thank you so much for joining me today. I wonder, can you start by telling me a little bit about you, your research background, where you're based, and what motivates you?
Okay, well, thank you for having me. Yes, I'm based at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where I'm a professor of sociology and also the founding director of the Science and Justice Research Center. My background and my area of expertise is really in genomics, where I started as a researcher now many years ago, and in the early 90s when it was just becoming a field. I then became very interested in genomics as a kind of phenomenon in the world, and the social issues raised by genomics. And that, I think it's worth noting, is partly because when I got interested in genomics, it was right when the Berlin Wall had fallen. There was a lot of optimism about all of us coming together. Genomics was a new science at the time, and it was arguing that it would bring all the world's peoples together by showing us that we're all really one human species. And I had a real interest not just in science, but also in politics. And I thought, well, this is a field. And I had a real interest in justice. I remember the first social justice. And I remember the first article I read about what was called Genomics and Justice in 1992. But then I was going to go off and be a graduate student working on the Human Genome Diversity Project. And this project was arguing we're going to collect, we're going to represent the world's human genetic variation, and that's going to show us that we're all one people, and we're going to go around the world to do this and collect blood from indigenous peoples. And I was going to be a graduate student working on this project. And luckily, I decided to not work on the project because it then became described as the Vampire Project, a project more interested in sucking the blood of indigenous peoples than in their continued survival. And so I guess my career has been devoted to trying to figure out how do we as scientists who want to do good in the world, who want to advance the cause of anti-racism, who have social justice interests, do science in a way that we're not, being accused of being racist, colonialist. I think that this took a lot of scientists off guard who were part of this project. Why was this the case? And so I wrote a book about why the Human Genome Diversity Project faced so much controversy. Scientists do not get a lot of training in the social issues involved in their science. They end up walking into situations that I think it would be, with a little amount of training, they would understand. There are obviously social political issues here that need to be addressed. We will improve the trustworthiness of our science. We will have a better chance of ensuring that we're actually doing what we say we want to do, which is to benefit the world's peoples, if we had a better understanding of those issues. So that's, in a nutshell, what I do. We founded this, I was a co-founder of the Science and Justice Research Center at Santa Cruz, which is a globally unique endeavor that doesn't put ethics at the center, which I think is, interesting. You might ask me about this later, about what do I mean by justice. But for us, the reason why we didn't found some center on science and ethics is because we found that our colleagues, for them, ethics had become a bureaucratic operation. It's like, a form I have to fill out or a web training I have to do. And I've just got to click those boxes, literally, and and in order to not get in trouble. So it was individuals not getting their institutions in trouble. And what we wanted to do was every morning when we woke up to ask the question, what kind of world do we want to live in? And for us, that's a project of the world to be, the world to come, which is a project of justice, of like, how do we build a world in which more people are included and where their lives are being supported, where their aspirations, not just like basic needs, but aspirations are being supported. So that's, yeah.
I really like the point you make about it. I mean, the tick box nature of it is so relatable. For some of the work that I've done in research and in science communication, it reminds me a lot of things like risk assessments, where people feel that it's a barrier to overcome rather than something that enables them to do better work, which is exactly really how the ethical consideration should be seen, but often aren't. It is seen as, yet another thing that we need to get through. Do you think that we do enough to instill an appreciation for social science and the impact that we can better understand the impact of the work that researchers are doing through social science? Or do you think that we're still really lacking in including it in the research that we do?
Okay, well, how I would answer that is I also think the social sciences have work to do. I think that we're living in a moment, still in a period after World War II, where all the sciences and the social sciences as well, like presented themselves as a space of purity, as a space that had no politics, as a space of neutrality that could bring the world together. In fact, the project I'm working on right now is looking at from 1945 to basically 1955 and how the science policy of the global order got built then. And I think what you see there is this real desire to say it was politics, it was the politicization of science that in a large part led to racial hygiene policies in Nazi Germany, that led to the Holocaust. And therefore the answer is that we need to depoliticize science, which I think has led us into a trap, actually. And one thing if I had a big argument at the moment, is that I would really like us to move beyond a Cold War politics and policy of science in all domains. And to recognize that if what we're talking about is power and differential distribution of power and who has access to the resources to ask questions about this world, which is science allows us to be curious about our world, to ask, to know about the world. That is a very valuable resource. We have finite resources to do that. So decisions are being made about who can and who cannot have access to that very powerful resource. And those are questions of power. So if that is what we mean by politics, then there are politics in science. So we need to be more articulate about what we mean by politicization, so we don't get ourselves into a trap where we pretend that we're all neutral. Because doing that means that on any given day, any person can see that the science enterprise has politics in it. So if you want to tell them that it's not political, they won't trust you. So you need to be more articulate about what you mean. We need a more articulate politics of science. We need a more articulate science policy. And that's going to require a real culture change in science too. I mean, I think, all of these, for good reasons, these discussions really got banished from the laboratory. Like if you started talking politics, that then there was this fear that, what had happened during World War II would come back. There was a real concern, well, we cannot be political. So I do think that there's a deeper problem that those tick boxes cannot change. I would say instead of social sciences, I would say we need a deeper appreciation for how social issues are embedded in our science. And I actually think that, our best science will be the science that's able to engage those social issues, because that science is going to be the science that's trustworthy. That science is going to be the science that opens its doors to more diverse ideas and allows us to benefit from the great wealth of different ideas that are in societies. And that this very closed Cold War, us versus them, approach that we have right now, the good people and the bad people, is really inhibiting the scientific enterprise. So
I really like that you talked about how it really is impossible to think of science as not, being politicized and research not being politicized, because I think you're absolutely right. And I like the way that you phrase that we need to be more articulate about it. A lot of the way that science and research more broadly is done, even now, is based on kind of power dynamics and structures that were created hundreds of years ago,
Mm-hmm.
that in a time when to ask questions and explore to find the answers was a real privilege of
Mm-hmm.
quite a small group of people.
Yeah.
Does it frustrate you that we continue to do research in this way? Do you think we're
Mm-hmm.
doing the best research, or do we need a research revolution?
No, I definitely think we need a research revolution. I think the way you bring us back to the hundreds of years is important. And we're here speaking in the United Kingdom, which everyone's going to know about the Royal Society. That was a group that was a very small group of privileged people who had access to that society. And those, it's hard to break out of the networks that were created then, the informal ways in which power was being distributed, the who did you know approach to science, the are you trustworthy? Even using the language of trustworthy is in a way a way trustworthy to whom? Okay, so unless we are saying we want our science to be trustworthy to our broader publics, but not and not saying we want to be trustworthy to the people who hold power, then I think we won't be changing anything, because it's true that these networks, these very small networks, that founded science, it's hard to break out of them unless you really address that, unless those are the politics you're addressing. Right, because we tend to have our eye focused on the big politics, the macro politics, the what did Donald Trump do to science, as opposed to what are we doing to science by not asking about our insider politics, the way that we distribute unevenly power and resources in this community, and stop othering the politicization problem by saying it's those people who are politicizing. We don't politicize. And I think we have to get honest about what's going on in fields, and particularly fields that have a lot of power, like genomics, which is the field I'm in. One thing I learned, you're coming up as a researcher. I don't know many people, I'm sure maybe some of them exist, that went into science because they wanted to have a lot of power and resources, and certainly none that were interested in making the world a worse place. Like people go into it often with idealistic, interests, but then you get these rude awakenings, of, oh, actually this is an institution. Like, it's not, the scientific method isn't just come up with a question, have a hypothesis, gather some data and test it. Like, they should include in the scientific method that we get taught. You then have to navigate power relationships with your PI or with the head of your laboratory. You have to figure out what to do when you go to another country and you don't hold the same values as the people you're working with. For example, when I was first doing my research, I spent a summer on a small island off the coast of Hawaii, where the other researchers there were from Israel, who had just gone through the first Gulf War. Wow. And I'm a very young researcher having to navigate these very different cultural, political, gendered expectations. And that was one of the things that led me to think about leaving doing science. I didn't know what to do. I was a young scientist really being introduced to some of these gender dynamics, sexual politics that, no one informed me anything about. Yeah. So I do think we need to grow up and have Donna Haraway had this great line. She's, someone who has really inspired my work over the years. Donna Haraway, who herself started out in biology, did her PhD with Sherwood Washburn, who was one of the founders of the fields of population genetics, which I got very much interested in. She has argued that we need to move beyond Peter Pan, like adolescent science, and grow up, and have adult conversations about, the full totality of what it means to do science.
I really like that you're almost advocating for honesty and transparency in the things that are still not where they should be.
Yeah.
I used to be an academic. I did it for 6 years in an engineering department. And honestly, for that entire 6 years, and this was after my PhD, just felt like I was a unicorn that had landed from Mars. I just didn't fit in this culture at all. And I think maybe worse, nobody saw the benefit of trying to include different people within that culture. And so I do think a lot of people end up leaving because they get tired of trying to fight it and change it from the inside. You also talk about, access to resources, but also access to the production of knowledge and contributing to sort of the corpus of research information that is out there. If science is, and it should be, this global endeavor, and if it should benefit all of society globally, when I think about some of our big challenges like climate change, for example, do you think people have equitable access yet? And if not, why not? And what can we do?
I mean, the simple answer is no, there's not equitable access to the resources of science. And there's so much that needs to be done in that regard. I mean, from really brass tacks, nitty-gritty issues like, our funding in science is still a matter of national policy, public funding, not private funding. It's actually an interesting place where private funders do have a way in which they can contribute to a problem, which is that if in the US, if I want to partner with my colleagues in Namibia or in Uganda, if I can't take the money that I got from the National Institutes of, we can't, it's not easy to transfer funds. And also, my colleagues outside the US can't be PIs, right? And sometimes it would be appropriate for them to be the PIs. I don't want to be so the power dynamics are such that, it's still the case that in a lot of cases, the PIs come from wealthy countries and then they partner with people outside, who are from less resourced countries. And so how do we overcome that? And that in a moment where, at the global level, science is very politicized, where nations like the United States are very concerned about, keeping money, going to the American people, so science becomes a resource of building our nation. So that inhibits this kind of global ethics that science, I think, has. I think many scientists, one of the wonderful things about science that I do think is true is that there is an ethic of working globally, and there has been for a long time. In fact, that was one of the reasons that after World War II, when the bomb had just dropped and we had just gone through the use of genetics by the Nazi regime, there was no real good reason to say, oh, science is going to rebuild, the world. Some people were saying, why? You just obliterated millions of lives, so why should we trust science? The argument actually made by Joseph Needham, who I'm about to go to his research institute, archival research, just after our interview, the argument he made, and he's the one who made the successful argument to include the S in UNESCO, to have there be science in the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, because it was just going to be UNESCO, the United Nations Education and Cultural Organization. His argument was that scientists know how to work globally, and we need to be a global world. There was a real belief in a global world. And what happened was the Cold War. And we did not end up with a global world. So there's that real problem that we're living in a Cold War society still. That is a deep problem. And, I've thought a lot about, how can we in the scientific community build networks that are truly global? How is that going to get funded? Where's the trusted funding source going to come from? It can't just be, whoever the funders are going to have to allow there to be some kind of democratic ethos to how the funding gets distributed and not have their personal egos, from egos to ethos, not have their egos attached to that money. Like, how do we create, there's been a lot of foundations that have been created to fund science. And the question is, well, what are the ethics and policies of those foundations? Are those the ethics and policies that we think are really going to enable this kind of global world? So there's so much that needs to be done here. We could have a whole interview, attached to that. But equitable access, and let me come back to that equitable access, even if we're just talking about a nation state like the United States. So under the Biden administration, there is in the United States the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which advises the president on matters of policy. And for the first time under the Biden administration, we had the OSTP create an Office of Science and Society. This is the first time this was created. And Alondra Nelson, takes that
who
position.
we love.
Yeah, Alondra, who is a great colleague of mine, and we were working together when she first got that, the offer to create that office. She's trained in science and technology studies. She's trained in cultural studies. She is not your typical science policy person. The first time we had someone in that the highest levels of science policy who could think deeply about these issues. And she did some brilliant work rewriting science policy and sticking language of inclusion and equity into science policy. And you could say, oh, that's just changing the language. But the thing is, once you change the language and it becomes a rule, then people have to figure out what to do about it. And so I think that in the US, we have an opportunity now to really work on this. I am currently working in a study group that's helping the National Science Foundation figure out how to implement some of the language that the Office of Science Technology Policy got in a couple of years ago that instructs the new directorate of National Science Foundation, the first new directorate we've had in decades, to include social science expertise into a lot of the research that it does. And so there is this opportunity now. Now we are making concrete suggestions now. Yeah. And we could have another interview about what that looks like.
I feel like we should.
Yeah.
I think some of the memos and some of the kind of agendas that had come out recently really do, as you say, amplify the impact that these things have on society. Even, most recently the one about AI and how we need to create a more considerate way of doing this research. I'm gonna pick up on some of the politics in a moment because it's 2024 and it is a fascinating time. Everyone's favorite sitcom if you like politics, right? But I do want to pick up on something that you mentioned earlier, which was justice. Yeah. And how we can define justice. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I can. So, having, being the founding director of a science and justice research center, we spent a lot of time on this question of what do we mean by justice. And one thing that we'll say off the bat is that justice, we have to be always critical of how we're defining it, because one of the dangers of justice is that it becomes unquestionable. Like you say, well, this is just, and so therefore. And so I think it's very important to always be asking ourselves again and again, what do we mean by justice? And who is the us who gets to define it? For me, I'll tell you what it is, and I think it orients our center. It's a move away from an individual-focused idea of how we're going to change science. It's about collectivity. It's about having the skills to create collectives that can work across differences, which is not something that we normally get trained to do in the sciences, but is so, so needed. I mean, that basic issue of how do we create a collective, who's the we that does that? We need to spend a lot more time on that issue. And then for me, justice is aspirational. It's not asking what I shall not do, but why am I here? What are the questions that urgently need asking? We have finite resources on the planet. So what is the most important thing to be asking, and what can the collective that we've just formed, what are the questions that we are inspired and we feel are urgent to ask? Not because we asked them for the last several hundred years, but because now they need to be asked. And so, and then I think, equity has to be a part of it. we have for too long, the institutions of science have, built on the networks. It was who you knew. It was, I had the right, we always hear these stories about the good mentors, right? And we always need a good mentor. And this is important, why I think there's been so much emphasis on changing who gets to get to the top, because those people on the top have to change, because we are basically dealing with a system of, it's a very feudal system still, and so I think if you were to take equity seriously, then the feudal system would have to change, because it's not terribly equitable. So I do think putting equity, I know we also have to be self-critical about equity. I mean, we can't, anything we embrace like that, like inclusion and diversity now, it's become a political football, these things, especially in the US. Equity has gotten a little less of a, it's interesting because it's not quite been, you can still do some interesting work with equity. And I don't know for how long. Because whenever equity is usually the E and DEI or ED or whatever it is. And, it doesn't get pulled out as, these people are focused on equity. It's always diversity and inclusion that they attack. So I think we have to be aware of how those bigger politics are affecting the work we're doing, but to keep our focus on what really matters, which is how do we build worlds where a greater diversity of lives gets supported and cared for, and where more of us can live inspiring lives, not just we're just in drudgery, like managing to live, but we're inspired when we wake up in the morning, we're inspired to be on the planet rather than dreading, like what is to come. So, and I think science, what the special place of science is, I think, is that for many people, it still is that space of inspiration. And we want to hold on to it as that space of inspiration. Because without that, why do we get up in the morning? And so science has a huge cultural resource in that sense. And it's a huge political resource, and it gets used that way, because it does have such power for people. But we need to ensure that it lives on as that thing that people continue to be inspired to do.
We keep talking about politics because it really is so important. And this year, we're seeing a lot of potential change. And with that can come challenges, but also opportunities as well. We have a brand new government here in the UK. And so we, are trying to work out how they're going to be navigating the science scene and international collaborations and things, how they're going to support innovation and impact of that innovation for all, we hope.
Yeah.
We're seeing lots of political change across many countries this year. There tends to be sort of a change in some attitudes. You talked about individualistic endeavours versus collective endeavours. Maybe it's just my echo chamber, but sometimes it feels that we're going more towards that individualistic endeavour and that way of thinking at the moment. In this time of political change and flux, what would you like to see in terms of policy engagement from the public and in terms of what politicians are able to do to maybe help benefit society as best they can?
Woo.
Yeah, sorry, it's a lot.
Well, I think there is, with new leadership comes new opportunities, good or bad. I think in the science realm, I think that it's, for in the United States, it's such an uncertain landscape. I think working internationally will be important. I think those of us in my community are trying to figure out how to really stay connected to one another during this time, and to even if the politics, go in a direction that mean the values that we think should be at the heart of our best science are not being supported by our governments, that we manage to work collectively across political lines to do that work. And I think a lot of us are just like in advance. I know so the United Kingdom, we hope will, who knows what happens.
Know.
We don't know in this, we don't know. It's
we
true.
Just hope.
We just hope, right? We do know that the U.S. Went through a very set of very challenging circumstances after the 2016 election. And I think now, having learned from that, people are in advance of that, trying to figure out how do we protect certain institutions' access to data, making sure that things like, like in the U.S., the Environmental Protection Agency had itself, like access to data was withdrawn. Things were shut down. We want to ensure that how do we think in advance, so that we're more prepared this time. I think people will be more prepared this time. I know even in Silicon Valley, there are people who are actually coming up with plans now for what happens if the government comes in and says, we're on an emergency situation and you now must direct all of your resources towards this goal that we have. Yeah, so those are things that, when I said to get real about science, this is what I mean. Like, you have to be talking about your strategies. This is political.
Yeah.
And how do we, do politics in a way that values that support the greatest number of lives, that open us up and don't close us down, that move us back beyond a Cold War, us versus them, closed, approach to the world, is not what dominates. And that's got to be a project of people working across sectors, across nations. I'm seeing a lot of that happening, and that's very inspiring. I think a lot of people are motivated by a fear of, and by a fear of what might come, but also of a set of possibilities that have been, set up by the fact that we do live in a world now where it's easier to connect with people around the world. How do we make, the best use of these global, networks that we have, digital networks that we have? So I think that's the part that I think finding where you connect, like where can you connect? Where can you help build these networks? How can you leverage the networks you're in to help those networks become more effective? I won't say more powerful because I'm, but how do we connect with one another? When I said earlier about being articulate, articulation is like my forearm to my upper arm. This is an articulation. It's a join. It's how can we make this connection in our networks to more networks and become more articulate in that sense. I think this is a moment where we have, there's a lot of motivation to do that. I think a lot of funders are wanting to listen right now to how do we do things differently, at least in the US. This is happening a lot. Like, someone with the kind of training that I have is being asked a lot more to advise on what shall we do? How do we incorporate a concern for these issues into the fabric of research? There's a genuine interest, I think, there. And I think there's an opportunity to take advantage of that. And so I will leave the bigger politics up to the, I don't know what to say about that, but I can talk about in the research communities what I think we can be doing.
Can't think of a better way to end our conversation for now. Professor Jenny Reardon, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been a fun, great conversation.